All right, folks, chasing up New Idiots Revolution. I'm here. I'm honored to be here with the son of Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Travis Orndorff, ladies and gentlemen, is joining us. Thank you, Travis, for taking time out of your day. How are you, sir?
Well, Jason, you should be honored. The whole world should be honored, is what I'm told. So, if you recall, Gene Okerlund saying he was impressed, and my dad said the whole world's impressed. So,
the whole world's impressed.
I joke. I love to, as a child when we would be on the road, and this was all through, so I was out of the house at 19. We would talk promos. We would come up with these ideas, and Dad would practice them because they didn't have scripts, and he didn't have notes, and so we would talk so much smack in the car, going back and forth at each other, and it was so much fun. So I obviously am joking. It's an honor to be on here. It's an honor to share them with the world, and any opportunity I can work it into my schedule, I'm going to take the time to speak with yourself or anybody that loved my father, because over the past few years, I've come to appreciate fans in such a different way than I could have imagined. And social media, while it is, can cause an existential crisis, it also, it brought me meaning and purpose. I spent a lot of time, when I was young, the first, decade of my life where Dad was out on the road. And I can remember going to places where fans would line up for autographs, and man, I just wanted him to myself. Now, obviously, I've come to realize, that it's a natural instinct for a child. But, there was a point where I just hated fans. But when he passed and I was grieving, I had lost my rock like that. We were very, very close, and the way he passed and everything that I had to do at the time, people get back to life, they get back to work, and it was the wrestling fans that would reach out to me as just as Travis and ask how I was doing. And man, it's coming up on 4 years this year, but I'll be honest with you, Jason, I know this wasn't a question, but it hit me that everything in my life that has been good, whether it was the opportunities to go to school, when I was a kid, I went to private school, or, as I graduated, going to college, my first car, that doesn't happen without wrestling fans. And that paradigm shift that happened when I realized that, it made my childhood make sense that, man, you guys loved him and y'all had all these stories. I know you're going to share one, and how meaningful that moment was to you. Well, for me, it gave meaning to all the times he wasn't around, that now I know what he was really doing. And he was impacting lives. He was impacting, generations. He had an influence, whatever amount that is of influence. He had an impact, and that is, for me, was just a beautiful story for it to unfold for me after he passed.
I love that. I love how you said that. It started to make sense, and it started to give meaning and purpose to the times where you were without him and had to share him with. At the time, the WWF was starting to become national, so you were sharing him with the whole country, and then it grew into worldwide. So, when did you realize that? I mean, you knew your dad was a wrestler, but when did you realize that he was at the level he was when he was main eventing WrestleMania? When did that?
So, I was very protected from that reality. And what I mean by that is, I knew everybody at the Waffle House, and I knew everybody at the Cracker Barrel was going to ask for, a autograph. I remember being in airports, everywhere we went, it did happen. But the level of impact and the number of fans of WWF, now WWE, like, I don't think I realized how big it was until the last few years. Because I'll be honest with you, I didn't grow up watching wrestling. So to me, there was this faction. And understand, we have 370 million people in the U.S. So if you have 1.9 million viewers, that's not even it's not even 1% of the country. So I'm doing the math, right? Like, to me, that seems small because I'm looking at the percentage. But when I tell you, this happened this year. I went to, it's called the Worldwide Discipleship Association. My mentor, Hugh Kirby's a pastor at New Hope First Baptist, where my dad found his faith in Jesus Christ. And I'm sitting there at the table, and I'm at table one, and I'm convinced I'm at the wrong table because I'm like, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. But luckily, my buddy Hugh and his wife Mary Lynn were there and had invited me, and I'm sitting down, and this guy looks at my name tag. And you have to understand, it's not like I walk around saying, hey, I'm Mr. Wonderful Son. That would be crazy, right? That would be complete narcissism and also insecurity, right? Because obviously I don't have my own identity. But I'm sitting there, and we're talking like our faith at this moment, just kind of chit-chatting. He looks down and he goes, Orndorff, Mr. Wonderful? And so he was a pastor, or is a pastor, from Nigeria. And he is, when I tell you, like, I've said this before, I don't think I've ever been as excited or as happy as I've seen wrestling fans be when they mark out, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
I don't think I've ever had that much joy in anything. Like, I watch their face and I'm like, wow, like, I don't have that type of experience with much of anything. I feel the feelings, but that level of excitement about one thing, that's not me. I'm sitting there, and this guy's like, he wants to take a picture with me. And because of who my dad is, and he's saying his kids aren't going to believe it, and he watched my dad's matches, and then we get done and we take the pictures, and I'm honored, and then he's the keynote speaker, and I'm like, what is, like, so you know what I'm saying? Like, you're in these moments where you're not expecting somebody that is very much a leader in Africa, like in the country of Nigeria. He is out teaching people how to make shoes and build their economy. And this guy's a wrestling fan. And I'm like, man, worldwide is absolutely the right word. I get messages from Australia, the UK, Italy, France, India. It blows me away how big it is. I don't think until, honestly, after he passed, did I have any, because in my mind you just rationalize it as that was a period of life. He wrestled, 30 years ago, or 20, 25 years ago was his last match. To me, he's out of the spotlight. There's that season, the 15 minutes of fame, if you will.
Right.
So when I think about it now, and I just have started to, I've gone to 2 WWE shows in the last year. One in January, I took my oldest, and then this year I took some close friends and my partner, and she I found out, like, we're sitting there, and she tells me her daughter is a big wrestling fan, and I'm like, well, how funny is that? Like, so what I would say is like, you never realize how impactful somebody is in the moment. It's always the ripple effect that catches you off guard.
I think it's that's something that it's, again, you got so much more insight into who your dad was to us later in life. And you also mentioned that you weren't a wrestling fan growing up. Now, hearing that blows my mind from a fan's perspective, because your dad is a celebrity. I would have thought that you would have been the biggest wrestling fan. Or do you think it was, were you pushing back a little bit against it because wrestling was taking your dad away from you? Or did you just not have interest in it?
I'm deep down, I'm a nerd. Like absolutely. Like when people ask me questions about things, I am much more likely to go down this philosophical route of how these things work together. Understanding the time frames, my faith, my own. I went through years of struggling with substances after a couple surgeries, and luckily it was prescribed. So, but I had some problems. So talking about physical health, like I love that stuff. Man, I spent this last a month ago shaving down cast iron skillets, and to make them less sticky. So my hobbies, I was in karate. I collected baseball cards, but one, I think I was probably protected from it. Dad didn't really want me in that world. And the other one is, and this is just a flat truth. When I traveled with my dad, those guys you call heroes were just normal guys. I played poker with them. They watched me, took care of me, or kept me, an eye on me when my dad was in the ring. Like, we went to breakfast together. Kamala, the Uganda giant, like we were on a plane flight together to Australia that was like, 20 hours. And we talked, I'm pretty sure I talked a lot, but, I sat there and got to know him as a person. So when I found out, when I knew who he was, like I'd heard of Kamala, but like the way that people see him and the way that I saw him, I sat on a flight with him. We talked, we played cards. Like it was I had such a different experience that like you saw them walk out to the ring in their tights, in their boots, in all their garb, right? And they're coming out to the ring and you see your hero. Well, those men also had to take a shower and they were pretty disgusting. So I saw them naked in a pair of flip-flops, sweaty and smelly, and that is not attractive at all. So if you see your dad in his underwear, well, my dad doesn't count because he looked good in underwear, but most people, if you see your dad in underwear, you're like, Dad, that's pretty disgusting. Right. So it's kind of that same like I never saw them in the light you did. I talked to them. I had normal conversations. They asked about school. Brian Blair, for example, has been in my life since the day I was born. He was there in the hospital when I was born with my dad, wondering if that baby was really his because I was too good looking for the both of them. And I had a full head of hair, as if God doesn't have a sense of humor. But like they were just people. And I, people talk about, they put their pants on one leg at a time. Well, I actually saw it. I saw them put their pants on one leg at a time. And so it was a much different experience. So to watch them and elevate them would have been difficult because I knew their first name. Like my dad called Hulk Hogan Terry. So I called him Mr. Terry. Like I never called him Hulk Hogan, it was just a different perspective that had you been on the inside, it would be normal to you. It doesn't have, and I think it's probably why I didn't realize how big my dad was in wrestling because it was just, that's just what we did. I don't know any other reality.
Makes so much sense. I obviously never thought about it that way or heard it explained that way. However, we've got other kids who are not in the business, and you go to school, and in 1986 or 1985, your dad is the most hated wrestler in the world, literally, according to the magazines and things like that. What kind of feedback did you get from other kids who knew who your dad was?
So it's funny. When I was that age, I would have been 8 years old. So I was going to a small Montessori school. I was around intellects. Like at that point, they had me, I think I skipped second grade and I was in the third, fourth grade classes. That was not an environment that was conducive to people watching wrestling. Some of the dads did, but they certainly didn't say anything. So inside of school, I really didn't hear much. Now, when I went and I played rec baseball, And of course, Orndorff was across the
Yeah.
back of my jersey. I absolutely would hear horrible things. Like, people would be trying to figure out which one, the Mr. Wonderful son's on the other team, right? But all the kids on my baseball team, like they got to meet my dad. So it settled internally. But when we would play other teams, people would be looking for me. And when I showed up, I think they thought I was going to show up with a 6-pack when I was 7. Like, so they were like, well, he doesn't look like him. And, but I heard adults say like literally just say your dad's a,
Yeah.
POS, things
Yeah.
like that. So we got death threats. People don't remember the days of your number being unlisted, but you couldn't get our phone number. We changed it if somebody got a hold of it. So there was a lot of things that happened in my life that, again, normal to me. We were constantly changing our phone number. When we were out on the road. I've said this story, and I wish I had a better memory than I do. But the bottom line is that we had left through the back on an ambulance. Dad's like covered up, and they're driving us down a couple blocks because we couldn't park close to the stadium because of how hated he was. And we were leaving, and as we were leaving, somebody tipped the fans off. And they were trying to push our car over, and I'm like, my dad's stuffing me in the floorboard. So what I would say is like there was a level of normalcy for me. Like nobody said anything at church, nobody said anything at school. It was when people that weren't in my small little world found out about it, and then you would hear it, and you'd be surprised. I always joke. The word kayfabe means something totally different to me than it does to everybody else. For me, it meant, Travis, shut up and get over here, because it would be like me and my dad somewhere, and an adult would ask questions, right? So like the way anybody would, but back then, the gig wasn't up yet, right?
Yep.
And so they would ask questions about where do you live, like really inappropriate things that you wouldn't think an adult would know better than to do. But I would hear kayfabe, and that meant quit talking, get over next to me. And so, like we were constantly navigating, being Mr. Wonderful's family. But which caused me a lot of anxiety as a child. I remember one time my mom got a speeding ticket, and when they came up to the car, they go, Mrs. Wonderful, right? And I'm a big fan of your husband. I'm just going to let you off with a warning. And I started crying. And my mom's like, why are you crying? And I'm like, because I just want to be treated like everybody else. So what I'll say is the hard thing to do when people do elevate your father, and then you absorb the expectation that comes with it, which is my own, I think it's just human nature. Man, I felt alone a lot. I felt like I was the only one in the room a lot. I felt like there was it just kind of hovering over me, for a good period of life. And it took me a while to really dissect that and get rid of that expectation that, I internalized.
And I really appreciate it. This completely different view. Really sheds a lot of insight into the son of a famous celebrity, a famous wrestler. So
Well,
on a
let me share
yeah,
one thing with you.
yeah,
I'm friends with several wrestlers' kids.
sure.
And many of them are wrestling fans and do watch it. Like I don't have any problem with it. It's just not my thing, right? And so a lot of them, unfortunately, they lost their dads pretty young in their life.
Yeah.
And this is just my psychoanalytical bullcrap, but I think I didn't connect to it because it was always there. I
Agreed.
think if my dad had been famous and he died in his, early 40s, I probably would have a different, and I had been 12 or 13 years old, I might have a different appreciation or perspective on it. So when I see a lot of these young people, that I say young people, they're I'm 46, so they're young to me. They're in
Yeah.
their early 30s, and so when I see them and they love the product and they watch it, I get it. I think in a way they're trying to connect to that world, whereas I felt so connected to it. I wanted anything I could do to disconnect from it so I could just be me, because it was hard enough just being me.
If you watch, you talk about, being in dangerous situations out in public. If you watch some of the shows, not necessarily the television, not necessarily the Saturday morning television. I was telling you earlier that I have a huge footage collection. When your dad was involved in some high level angles, we'll call them, when he was the top bad guy, the crowds in New York City, the crowds in Philadelphia, the crowds in Boston were dangerous. And
Oh
and
yeah,
I'm not,
that's
I'm
where
not
that's where the car incident happened. I think
yeah.
it was either in Boston, Philadelphia. It might have happened in both, because some of this runs together after a while. I think I probably tried to block it out.
Well, and I'm watching it and I'm uncomfortable. I'm actually, I'm uncomfortable watching how angry the crowds were in some of these towns and how the bad guys had to get to the back as quick as possible because they were being assaulted on the way to the dressing room, with whether it was cups of beer or whether it was fans. It's terrible. They were
So here's what
fight.
I'll tell. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Here's what
No,
I'll tell you about that. Number one, when I was 21 years old, I went, like, there was things I never asked my dad until I got older, right? And then after 21, it was all on the table. And but I remember asking him like some of his scars, and all of them came from leaving the ring and somebody breaking a bottle over his head, right? He talked about darts getting thrown in the ring. But here's what I'll tell you. I've learned something very, very, I think it's very important to contrast this in this way. When my dad, and things connect later on because you get older and you start to,
sure.
think through it. My dad said when he was at the Hall of Fame, the WWE Hall of Fame, he just walks up. Like, I remember I go, Dad, do you want any notes or anything? He's like, no, I got it. He did that off the top of his head. And so he gets up and he says, I played with your emotions. And at the time when he said that, I thought, well, that just sounds like he's in character, right? Like, that was what went through my mind. And then the advent of social media, Dad was trolling you. That's like that was the original troll
Working the marks.
but the thing I will tell you is I see that level of hatred online when somebody makes a comment, because I will tell you, our social media following, I manicure it. If you say something that I find to be either inappropriate or I don't know what it means even, or if it's negative, I just delete it. I don't engage in that, and I don't want anybody to read it, because this is a place of love, honor, respect. There's some funny things, but my dad had this, the gym skit, right? Like,
Yeah.
so we posted that. God, it was, a few weeks ago, and man, I'm like, man, he's still getting heat. 40 years later, he's getting heat from that video. So you see the comments from these women, and like, they will be like, say like horrible things like, he was so fit he died, and and then I respond kindly. I'm like, you're not going to believe this, but no matter how fit he was going to die. That happens to everyone.
Right.
By the way, he survived stage 4 throat cancer in his 60s. He lived to be 73 years old. He was honored and loved by all of his grandchildren and children, and he was a tender and loving and amazing father and grandfather. So people, like, when I see it online today, this may sound weird, but people don't like to be disliked anymore. Like, even, in wrestling, because back in the day, being hated, you didn't sell merchandise, right? But nowadays, if you got to have a fan base in order to sell merchandise. So they really aren't completely horrible. In fact, I'll be honest with you. I don't think, this is just my minimal interaction. Is it Logan Paul, right?
Yeah. Logan
He's
Paul.
the best heel I've seen in years because he doesn't mind being hated.
Hated.
Like they hate him. Like when I was and I've been to 2 events and he's been at both. And when somebody came out, like I knew they were the bad guy, like I knew they were the heel, right? But they weren't getting a pop. Dude, that dude walks out and I'm telling you, this 17-year-old girl behind me, I'm sitting there with my girlfriend and just starts dropping F-bombs. And I'm just like, whoa. And it was kind of nostalgic, because he doesn't mind being hated. And he's pretty good at it, right? So it's funny to see how, marketing, merchandising, all of that has evolved and changed who people like. But I'll say that to say this. He was hated. And I heard this from Bobby Heenan when we were sitting in the back at the WrestleMania. I don't remember the number. He said, Travis, when we got to some of these towns towards the end of the run with Hogan, he goes, more people were cheering for your dad than they were Hogan. And Vince didn't like it. And that's why he started to suppress him and not put him over, because he was getting more, he was winning people over a period of time in spite of his heel nature. And I think it's because he was just so darn intense. It was hard not to believe he couldn't tear anybody up. He was rabid, man.
Oh my goodness. I want to talk about his, like I was saying, I watched, obviously this was all I did as a kid, quite opposite of you. I ate, slept, and breathed this stuff. But then as an adult, I go back and I watch it with different eyes. Your dad on TV, when the guys that he fought on Saturday morning they had different names for them: job guys, enhancement talent, whatever. When I watch him against these guys today, he's killing them. And even from somebody who's aware of what's going on in there, I've heard stories over the years that the top guys needed to look very intense in the ring, and they needed to toss these guys around like crazy. And your dad has the reputation of being stiff, of being a hard worker. And whether he's pulling it off or whether he's really giving it to him a little bit, he looks terrifying in that ring on Saturday mornings.
So I've never heard that reputation of him being stiff.
Okay.
And I certainly have never heard from a single person that he ever hurt anybody or, in fact, I've heard the complete opposite, that
Great.
from everybody I've ever spoken to, that Dad respected and honored those men when he wrestled with them, and often gave them advice and cared for them. I think he was, at least my understanding, even Arn Anderson has stories of when he was young and in the business and Georgia Championship Wrestling, how my dad pulled him aside. So what I would tell you is, I do know, whether Dad had a really high motor, and that whole intensity and the way he wrestled was a direct impact from Bill Watts, because he was wrestling, I think he was a mid-card, and Bill pulled him aside and said, Paul, if you don't show me something tonight, like, this is your last match. And Dad let it loose. And when he did, he never put that genie back in the bottle. And so he's known for that. His punches just look so real. He had such a good punch. And it was so intentional. Hulk Hogan, if I'm not mistaken, said Dad was the toughest SOB he ever met, and that Dad got the best matches out of him. So I think, I'm curious, because that's the first time I'd ever heard he had that reputation.
You know what? The reputation is amongst fans. That's it.
Uh,
It's not
okay. Okay.
because we're all talking, we're all watching these matches, going, "Oh, it's Orndorff. He's a killer in there. It's Sid Vicious. It's the Road Warriors. They're killing guys."
No, actually, Dad was the opposite. Dad, if you think about it, he delivered in some cases multiple pile drivers to the same guy in the same match. Not once have you ever heard about anybody getting injured. So what I would say, yeah, if a fan thinks that makes more sense because they get caught up in what they think they see.
Right.
But the reality is, I'll tell you, in fact, I was, I'm not close to these folks, but we interact occasionally. Dustin Rhodes, we
Yeah.
posted a match of my dad and Dustin, at WCW back in the day. And, it was on X, and he responded, I loved him so much. And I'll tell you, remember, there's a very few times, I didn't ask my dad wrestling questions. That was his job. I overheard things, and I was there when stories came out. I knew what my interactions looked like and what it looked like, what I saw happen. But it was a rare thing for Dad to talk about a match, and I certainly didn't bring it up. But I knew Dustin was wrestling, and I knew Dusty, right? So Dad was wrestling, and I said, well, how is he? He's like, that kid can work, right? And it's funny to say that because I think he's in his, mid-50s now. So he would have been, God, it would have been 35 years. So he'd probably been 22, 23 years old. But, it was, for people like Steve Austin,
Yeah.
Arn Anderson, I will tell you, Brian Blair, Tito Santana. I think my dad was known for having a short fuse. His nickname, just so you know, and so Brian Blair's nickname for my dad was Beeper. He always called him Beeper, and Brian always called him Oscar because that was his nickname because he was like Oscar the Grouch, and so he had a short temper for sure. But what he brought to the ring, the integrity, and I think even his strength, I think, did he work those guys and make them work? Absolutely. But I think he helped them with their craft. I think they admired him for doing that. And, the people that I know, that my dad gave advice to, through the years that I've talked to, have nothing but admiration for him. But they also know, you don't piss him off because he earns the name Oscar.
Well, I'll tell you, if you go back and you said you made a point putting, those guys' job was to put your dad over, but in a sense, your dad is putting them over. He's making them known because there's a guy named Rudy Diamond that I never would have known, okay, unless it was for the Rudy Diamond versus Paul Orndorff Saturday morning TV match, where Rudy Diamond makes the biggest mistake of his life by egging on the Paula chance. And
he left and got a T-shirt.
He left and got a T-shirt, brought it back in. Your dad killed him. Your dad killed him. And it looked so good and so scary. And that's how I remember Rudy Diamond.
His legs, man. I remember he sold those legs look like spaghetti noodles after. I mean, dude, I have, and see, the thing is I think the name Jobbers was always disrespectful.
Oh, sure.
But they called women ring rats. Let's be honest, wrestling's roots is not founded at Harvard University, right? It's backwoods. It's trailer parks. The national stage it's on now was a long evolution from the circus to Madison Square Garden was, nearly a century. And so the popularity that came with it, but I never heard my dad talk negative about a lot of things or people. He may be in a bad mood, but if you're a wrestler and you earned your stripes, then he respected you. Now, if you weren't willing to work or you came into the ring drunk or high, you were going to get it. He was going to go even harder on you if you
Yeah.
did something like that. But what I'll tell you is those guys, it's funny because many of them were excellent wrestlers. Mike Sharp is an example of somebody we posted something on him. Like some of those guys were legit great. People don't remember very well the Armstrongs, but Brad Armstrong, oh man, what a wonderful, wonderful wrestler. And so, when you look at those men, you have to know they knew they had a role. They served it well. Um, and that was a season in their life where they didn't get to be top talent, but that it was a lot harder to get into wrestling back then. Like I talk to a lot of people they say I'm in the business, and I'm like, really? And then they tell me, and I'm like, an independent show, that's a hobby until you make it. Like no offense, but until you are that's a career as a wrestler where you're traveling and doing something on the weekends with the church. I get it. I respect you for doing it. But what those men went through and the training they went through to get in front of a national audience, that's a hell I wouldn't want to walk through.
Well, I'll tell you, on a lighter note, I had a dad, and
I assumed.
I assumed so. He was there, 7, 8 years old, and we'd wrestle with my dad. My dad wasn't a professional wrestler, so his wrestling us consisted of him sitting on the floor and me crawling on his back, and he'll flip me over his shoulders and tickle me, and I'll do it again 50 more times. You had a wrestler for a dad, so did he show you some things? Did you get to wrestle with your dad?
So yes, I think it's fun. In fact, there was a charity event once where he wrestled like the high school coaches. I think Ray was there. In fact, Glacier. I think he was even there.
Yeah.
But he wrestled the high school coaches. Of course, they didn't know how to wrestle or whatever. But he pinned all of them, and if he pinned all of them, then he got to pick who his next opponent would be. Well, he chose me. I come into the ring. He's tossing me around, and then he starts arguing with the ref, and I get behind the ref, and the ref pushes him over, and he falls over me, and I pin him. So not only did I literally get to wrestle with him in a ring when I was, God, I might have been 13, 14, and do that, but when we were home, here's why it looked different, because I actually did wrestle. Is when he was doing it, he was teaching you something. It wasn't. Like it was playful, but it turned into a lesson really, really quick. And so, he would, when he was doing it, he'd hold you there until he saw it's kind of like when I go to the gym with him. Like I hated going to the gym with him because I could be, like my first day in 3-4 months because school and whatever else. I wasn't driving at the time. And like my first set, he's doing one more rep. Well, by the time I leave there, I can't move my arms. I got a baseball game the next day. Like I never wanted to go to the gym because the recovery time was like 3 weeks. Like it was unbearable. Like, and so you got to know, like, my father was just intense. He was intense in everything he did. He was purposeful, and so it was always a lesson. I remember one time when I was in a karate tournament, and I got like third place. I lost to the guy that won, and then and I got third place. And like at the end of the match, the guy came up and like hugged me, right? And we're in the car, and my dad is lighting me up about my level of intensity. So you're hugging these guys; these are your competition, and like so he had these moments where I was like, oh, okay, like not that he had any problem with sportsmanship. He just had a level of focus that I think is just it's just rare in human beings to be. And I can be that way. Like I can get going, and it's on different topics, but. Most people meet me and they're like, where did you get that energy from? And I'm like, it's a long story.
Well, I'll tell you, I met firsthand that energy and that intensity. Uh, I'll I'll tell you my story real quick, and then I'll ask you a few more questions, and then I'll let you go. And I've always I appreciate your time so much. Um, it was about 8-10 years ago, and the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, not the WWE one.
The one in Wichita?
Well, it was in Amsterdam, New York at this time.
Okay, okay.
It's moved to Texas. There's ones in Wichita. There's the Cauliflower Alley, but this one was the PWHF.
Oh yeah, yeah. I got that ring.
Yeah, yeah. So that was your dad's induction year. So I went with my father-in-law, and we went to the ceremony was at the hotel. We stayed at the hotel. He and I were eating dinner. We went to the hotel restaurant, and I'm sitting there, and Jimmy Snuka and his wife are eating at a booth 20 feet from me. And again, I grew up with this stuff. I don't care how old I get; it'll always get me. So I'm watching Jimmy Snuka eat, and I'm trying not to be, ridiculously obvious. Well, then Paul Orndorff walks in, and he sits down at the booth with Jimmy Snuka, and Jimmy Snuka passes him his plate of pasta, and Mr. Wonderful is eating some pasta off Jimmy Snuka's plate. He calls over the waitress, and he orders dinner. They bring it. They're all eating, and I'm thinking, this is it. You're sitting across from these two guys. I went to the server and I said, I want to pay for these guys' meal. They got the bill together. I paid it. Then I went over to them, and you know how much wrestlers or anybody else likes to be bothered when they're eating. So I went over to them.
As a matter of fact, I do very well.
So I went over to them and I said, I'm sorry to bother you, but your meal's been paid for. And your dad, with the most intensity, he jumped up and he said, and I'm going to try to do it, but he said, "By who?" And I said, "By me." And my lips started to quiver. I said, "By me." And he got up and gave me the biggest hug. And Jimmy Snuka got up and hugged me. And they made us take photos with them. And I said, "No, you guys are going to do the meet and greet later." And he said, "No, we're taking photos now." And he took 15 poses and 15 photos and a handshake pose and an arm on the shoulder pose. And that was it. I shook their hands, and when I told them, they said, "Why? Why did you do?" I said, "Because you guys are my childhood. I'm never going to get this chance, and I'm sitting here, and I'm doing it." And it was awesome. And then the next day, I saw him at the meet and greet, and he signed. Because again, you're signing for 500 people that day. You just write your name. Oh my goodness, he took up the whole photo with personalized. God bless you, Miss Number One, Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff. Thanks for dinner. And it's one of my most prized possessions. But not only that, it's just a prized memory. So I can't thank him for that. I already did. But thank you for that too. I want to thank him through you.
So I'll start with, that's the worst impression of him I've ever heard. We need to get that out of the way. Hey, what? Oh, who paid for it? That's what it sounds like. My best friend growing up used to describe, his voice sounded like, oh God, what do they call him? Like a chainsaw with, like the dummies that people have. Like, I can't think of what they're called at the moment. But, yeah, so I think what would surprise people, number one, I remember as a kid, people were deathly afraid of him. And it sounds dumb, but I was so unaware of it because I could get away with murder with him. Like, if he started getting angry and stuff, I'd start laughing. And he would start laughing. Like, because and there were times where he'd get going, I'd be like, "Yo, you ain't Mr. Wonderful right now." And so I remember, I want to say, I can't remember when it was, but somebody had asked me, I was a woman I was seeing, and I was going to meet her dad, and they were like, "Are you nervous?" And I'm like, "Are you serious? Like, why would I be nervous around that guy?" Like, and I didn't mean it disrespectfully. I just meant, like, look at what I grew up with. Like, I'm not scared of that. and yet, but the reason I wasn't scared of him, and the thing that you found out that night, is he was intense in everything, including how he loved people.
Yeah.
He was genuinely more grateful to fans than I can explain. Like, I can't make up. I can't think of words. I can't, like, I would be with him. Now, understand, when this was happening, and this is later in life, when I was in my 20s and mid 30s and even early 40s, like, when that was happening, and I saw how he reacted, like, at the time, I was still a little resentful. So like, I couldn't connect to him, how he would think about that, or how he appreciated fans. It was after the fact that I went, oh,
Yeah.
like, they're everything. Like, I owe my entire childhood to you guys, just like you got him during my childhood. Like, both of those are in sync. They're not separate. So he adored his fans. And I'm telling you, like, if there was a charity event, like the Special Olympics, like, we were there. And in fact, to tell you a little bit about my dad, if you ever made fun of somebody that had a disability,
Yeah.
you're going to think Rudy Diamond is a kindergartner, because he would light you up.
Yeah.
I remember one of my friends said something. He pulled him aside, and I bet the farm that man never said that word again. Like, there was just things, and my dad wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. He was flawed just like any other person. But I remember he went and did an autograph signing at a base when the troops were getting back after Desert Storm, I think. And like, they got done at 5:00, and I remember he called. It was like 9:00. I'm like, why are you calling so late? He's like, I just got done. I was like, I thought you were done at 5. But there was still a line, and he stayed there the extra 4 hours and signed every single thing he could for like. I remember us giving up our seat to somebody in the military, and people don't know that's how my dad worked. You don't know, and I recently said this. He was so intense in the ring, but he was just as intense with how much he loved. He was just as intense. He was so tender. Like, my niece, which I consider to be my sister because I grew up with her, my parents raised her, like, that's their pawpaw. Like, my nephew Chandler, like, he went hunting with my dad for 20 years. Like, so my dad was both things, right? He was both things. But I think when he played the heel, because he had a very traumatic childhood, when he played the heel, I've always believed that's where he got to exercise his demons. And by having that outlet, he was then able to love, respect, and be, because listen, the way, and my aunt and my uncle, they had different experiences, I think, than my dad did, and so I respect that. So it's not directed at any one person, but if you look at the childhood my dad had, it doesn't make sense that I end up the way I did. It doesn't make sense that the level of gratitude, love, sincerity, integrity, tenderness, grace. I got that from the same man that you got all the heal from, right? So it's a funny thing to kind of break down and recognize that when, what's funny is when people say Mr. Wonderful, because I can't say the word wonderful at all, because everybody's like, wink, wink. I'm like, dude, it's just saying the word. Like, it's not,
Word.
it's just a word. Like, but if I say wonderful, people get the nudge. I'm like, geez Louise, I'm gonna have to, like, find another word. It's amazing. It doesn't sound right. So, for me, the most wonderful part about his Mr. Wonderful is what you experienced that night. Cause that was the best part of my dad. The robes are great. The promos are awesome. The matches are stellar. But when you find out that the guy behind that has a heart of gold, that loves people, loves, families, loves children, loved his fans, like, that's what made him wonderful. It's that guy.
Well, and that's why this conversation is so important for us 80s kids who grew up with your dad to hear. We watched your dad get sick. And it was at a time, I think, when we were just I say we, kids who grew up with this era of wrestling, we were getting tired of watching our heroes die. A lot of them were dying young. A lot of them were dying from horrible circumstances. But we got to see, we watched your dad get sick, um, and at the end of his life, I believe you had posted a video on YouTube of your dad in the hospital with long hair and a beard and struggling with his illness. Um, and it's hard for me to watch because again, I'm watching, and I'm in the mental health field. I told you that privately. I have mental health practice. I do counseling for addiction and mental health for people.
Oh, I work in substance abuse and mental health too. I help people get into the Affordable Care Act so they can get into treatment. Yeah, we can talk about the neurological scans after 14 months. I'm all in with you, brother.
Well, when you posted that video, I saw a son who was a grown man, who was in that moment not a grown man. He was a little boy, and he was sitting with his daddy. And I think you called him daddy in the video, which is fine. I mean, my kids call me daddy, but I just saw the little boy. I saw the kid who realized that his father was not going to be here long. And then you posted that video, and I think it got some heat. It got some negative feedback. Why did you post it, and how did you deal with the feedback?
So it was during COVID, and I had gotten COVID several times during that period. And so I had seen him the previous November, right before COVID hit. And I saw the deterioration over several years. He came and stayed with me for several days after he was attacked. And, in his God, it was 2000, I think it was 2016. And I went and got him, and he lived with me for a little period of time. And I had to have directions taped up so he knew where to go to the bathroom. He couldn't remember. I don't think I've ever told this story, but he was showing my ex-wife and my son a gun, and he accidentally shot a bullet.
Oh,
and I was like, all right, everybody, bed, and so I saw that deterioration. So at that moment I didn't know where he was for a long period of time. And, with all transparency, and I'm comfortable talking about it today, and there was a time where I was very hesitant to share anything. My father was abandoned in the hospital, and when I got there, I walked in after they finally let me in because they would only let my mother in. Well, my mother hadn't been there. And I got there, and I was like, I'm taking him home. And they said, you are not. You don't have the rights. I said, well, who is on the call list? There's a call list at these hospitals. And it was two of my nieces who were incarcerated at the time and my mother. And I found out that she had been avoiding the calls and he had been left there. And I threatened them. Now, granted, you might have seen a little boy, but I was so angry. Like, it was fuming. And I also blamed myself because I didn't push harder for more information. So when I walked into that and was blindsided. I didn't expect that. I did not know that he had been there for months and that he wasn't being taken care of and that nobody was willing to take the phone. Because I had asked for custody of him 5 years before that. I wanted him to live with me. He wouldn't stay. He wanted to go home. And so after he had gotten attacked, I was planning on him living with me for the rest of his life because I was willing to take care of him and do whatever it took.
Sure.
I went through a divorce. I had multiple surgeries prior, and when I broke my arm and it was left paralyzed for a period of time, I had 3 surgeries over several years. And so I had a really rough patch during those years. I went through a divorce. My mental health was just atrocious after coming off. So they prescribed me 24 pain pills a day and 9,000 and 12 Percocet, 10 milligram, 1,250 milligram tramadol, and 9,000 milligrams of gabapentin. So I had my bicep came off the bone. My tricep twisted over, the bone went through the nerve, left my arm paralyzed. I ended up having wrist surgery where they moved the finger tendons over to my to my ulnar nerve. So when I came off those pills, I thought like everybody was giving me high fives, but all of a sudden I started having really, really, really bad mental health, like panic attacks, struggled with cross addictions. I'm fortunate I never went back to the pills, but I had a surgery every other year for like 6 years. So while that was happening to Dad, I was going through the worst hell that I have ever experienced, and nothing's even close. But they told me they could do nothing for me, and I said, if you don't give me custody of him right now, I'm posting this video about what happens at Grady Memorial Hospital. I don't care about COVID. Now, I couldn't share the context then. And you don't have to believe it, but my mom has since passed, and they were. I pulled the 911 records and found that the police were having to go out because they weren't answering the phone, and I threatened Grady Memorial Hospital. In about 24 hours, we had a solution, and so I went back and I took it down, but. Obviously, I remember, and I got a phone call from Brian Blair. He was hot, and he was talking about Dave Meltzer, and I didn't go online a lot, so that stuff wasn't what I do today on social media. I didn't have anything back then. I had an Instagram for 5 months before I got my dad, so that was all brand new to me. My ex-wife talked me into getting it. That's the only reason I had it because I didn't have any social media.
Right.
God's honest truth. I had nothing for decades.
Sure.
So in that moment, I was so angry and lost and scared.
Yeah.
And so I had filed I had called Adult Protection Services for several years, and I wasn't the only one. And during those years, I was calling them to go out there, and they, it was during COVID. I think it was the July before that, where I couldn't get in touch, and so forth and so on. And then, I talked to him, but then he would go for periods of time that I didn't know. And I was, my world was being rocked at the same time. So it was really hard to navigate my own issues and then go through that. So what ended up happening is they agreed to let him go to a facility. I had a phone call with my mother and was like, I want custody now. And there was a lady that was willing to take him. And so I was now in the situation where I have, they don't care if you're the son. If you're not the next of kin, which is in that case with my mother, I had no rights. I could not get the social workers got involved on the backside, but they did nothing for me directly. So we took him to another facility. When he got there, I went up and took him to get a shave and haircut and cleaned up. And I had talked to the woman, and I had requested that I be the sole emergency contact. My mother agreed to it. The paperwork was turned in. The woman, who will remain nameless, was in it with me and goes, your name's not on here. And I said, did you hear me say, put me first? And she goes, yes. And then I said, who's on there? And it was, again, the same people that were on the hospital. And I won't say what I was told because it is hearsay, but there was conversation about if he came to live me, where his check would go. Which was the least of my concerns. Sure. I was like, I'll pay for it. So that Sunday, we had agreed, because he had to be there for 72 hours. So that Sunday, we agreed we were going to take him to the hospital, get checked, because he was having struggles with he was asphyxiating. His brain, he quit telling his throat to open up. So the doctor, well, not at that point, but on that Sunday, I was driving up to the hospital to get him, and she calls me and she says, "Hey, they won't give him to you unless you take him to the hospital." I said, "Okay." So like I'm learning this as I go, right? So the next morning, that Monday morning, I drove up, I picked him up, I took him to the hospital. The doctors pulled me aside and they said, "Your dad is dying."
Yeah.
You have a choice. You have a choice. And the choice is you let him eat and you let him drink and stuff goes into his lungs and he dies a horrible death. Or you allow his body to do what it's trying to do and let him, don't hold anything back from him, but don't just force feed him. He's going to stop wanting to eat. And I kind of didn't believe him. So he came to live with me. And so for that probably like I think it was like 5 days from beginning to, it was like 7 days total, but from the beginning of the video to that point, I wasn't online seeing what anybody said. I wasn't on Twitter. I wasn't on Facebook. I had no clue. The only thing I heard was from Brian because he was upset. He was upset with me. And here's what I would say, and I'll tell you what I said to him, because how I would handle that today and how I handled it back then, those are two different things. I'm in a different place. There's knowledge and wisdom that comes with this. At the time, I was filled with so much anger and resentment, specifically towards my mother, that honestly part of me wanted to expose her to, because that situation, I died in that moment. Because I know I could have done more if I had been where I needed to be, and I wasn't. So it's neither here nor there. But when I left the hospital, they gave me, the social worker made all their arrangements, gave me custody of him, we were driving home, and there's a video of him, listening to music and tip.
Yeah.
So he came home, but going back to that period, when Brian was talking about like Dave Meltzer said that, he would be so embarrassed, don't share this. And I'm like, who's Dave? I'm like, who's Dave Meltzer? Like, that means nothing. Like, because I'm not in that world. I'm not online. They're like, Hannibal's going to show it. I'm like, who's Hannibal? Like Lecter? What are we talking about? Like, so I was so clueless to all of that. I wasn't online. The only person that ever told me anything negative was Brian. And from his perspective, I think he was right. I would have done it different. And I didn't know, first of all, it never crossed my mind how big it was getting. I was just trying to get the news involved. Like, that was my, so I had no clue. I had no clue who Dave Meltzer was. I had no clue who Hannibal was. I was supposed to do I remember I was supposed to do an interview, and Hannibal called me and said, "I can't do it. You got a lot of heat on you." And I'm like, okay, what is that? Like, people think and that's where, maybe just growing up with why would I care what other people think about my daddy? Like, you weren't there. You didn't call adult protection services for 7 years. You didn't beg them to go out and follow up with them and then put it out. You didn't go pick him up when he got attacked before. You didn't, you don't know what I went through up until that moment where, man, when I saw that, it was the culmination of 8 years of chaos. And I was the anger it's palatable. I can taste it. So when you see that video, that was me broken, because I didn't know what to do. And when they tell you no, you have no rights. I was like, I'm going to make. I knew social media would pick it up. I didn't know what that meant, but the heat I got for it. What I would tell you is, I don't disagree with you. I could have handled it better. I should have handled it different. Where I was as a person, I didn't have those skills. I was angry and resentful. I had at that point, I think I was on my 7th surgery and hundreds of injections. I just had my right arm for a few years, but it still half works. It's funny because, like when I had to do some things for Dad, you saw my email, one bad arm.
Yeah.
And that's because both of us have a bad right arm.
Yeah.
That video created an uproar. It also got me custody of my father. So know that, do I wish I had done it different? Absolutely. I don't regret it because I can't go back and learn what I've learned since that, 3.5 years ago. I was desperate and I had tried to work through the system for years and it didn't work. And I was like, okay, well, if this doesn't work, I'm going to embarrass some people and you're going to be forced to do what I want. And by the grace of God, that woman stepped in and said, I'll take him, and went through everything and went through the social work. So I was able to make arrangements on the back end that they wouldn't let me do on the front end. But, my mom got involved in order for that to happen. She had to agree to it. So once I got custody of him, and I say custody, but you know what I mean, and he came home with me, I took medical leave from work and I stayed with him every second of the day. I slept 30 feet from him. I slept on a couch. Just to be honest, there were days I didn't shower. My ex-wife would be like, you need to go shower. And I didn't have the energy. But I stayed with him. I held his hand. I prayed with him. Every day. I didn't. In fact, I think I slept in my bed one time in probably 3 weeks. And, I was there with him till his very last breath. And if you see that video and you have an opinion, that tells me more about you than it does me, because there's always context. And if context is missing, the thing is this video isn't going to go as viral as that did to bring people into the loop of what happened. I alluded to it, but I tried to be respectful. But the bottom line is, once I got to that wall, something turned on in my brain, and I wasn't giving up until I got the result I wanted.
Well, something turned on in your brain and made changes for you going forward. And I can't thank you enough, first of all, for your honesty and your openness and your candidness and your emotion. Being us both being in the mental health field, how powerful these conversations are. I'd love to talk to you about a part 2 of your life, even if it's not as wrestling related. I don't want to take, I don't want to, bring you in again and take up more of your time, but I would love
if I didn't want to,
send you a link to it, but I'll close it out here and then we'll talk afterward. But again, Travis Orndorff, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, of your life, to come and sit here and share some memories about your father. Show your father in a different light. Show him the business in a different light. Educate me about how a wrestler's kid doesn't necessarily have to be a big wrestling fan, and it makes so much sense. And again, I really appreciate your time. I can't thank you enough. We're going to do this again. We're going to do a part 2 if you're willing and ready, and we'll get that going in the next week or so.
Well, it's an honor to be on here and share. It is never inconvenient to talk about somebody that his life and everything that he wanted for me in my life has come to be. And I found a love. While I appreciate and respect wrestling, I love the wrestling fans. I love you guys so much, because I've seen what you give to the current talent, the way you respect the previous, talent. And so when I say, I think I inherited, I didn't get my dad's hair. I didn't get his muscles. I got his motor and I got his heart. And so when I say I love you guys. Like, thank you for allowing me to, just have a conversation about my father, the human being. Uh, I was the only kid that was 8 years old that was taking B12 and B12 shots and drinking protein, but you
Well,
can see it didn't take. But no, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about him, and I can see him behind your left shoulder, so it's an honor. That's funny because I can see him behind your left shoulder. The first thing I want is I feel him behind mine.